Thank you. I think it's safe to say that the excitement in the room this evening, the buzz around this event in recent days, comes from an obvious source. One writer's brilliance of storytelling, his boldness of imagination, and his awe-inspiring literary ambitions. That said, I'm admittedly surprised that you've all seen such greatness in only my first novel. And the rather brief description of my second, and I'd like to take the rest of this evening to tell you about my second novel. No. Instead of saying more about that, I myself would much rather hear one of the world's greatest contemporary writers, David Mitchell, discuss his latest feat of fiction, The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. David Mitchell was born in Lancashire, England, and currently lives in West Cork, Ireland with his family. Between these coordinates, he's lived elsewhere, perhaps most notably in Japan, the setting of his new book and some of its predecessors. And indeed, it's on the evidence of Mitchell's work so far, 5 novels translated into some 19 languages, that fellow writers, critics, readers, and prize juries alike continue to praise him for the brilliance and boldness of his writing. Indeed, in 2007, Time magazine named him the lone novelist to its list of the world's 100 most influential people. Mitchell's writing is so admired and indeed important because its technical wizardry and aesthetic showmanship, for which he receives abundant praise, are always in service of compulsively readable storytelling, and at its best moments, these are his means of revealing, in strange places and stranger still ways, nothing less than the universals of human experience. This evening, we had the pleasure of hearing from David Mitchell directly in discussion about the universals of human experience he reveals in turn of the 18th century Japan, when a young, devout Dutch clerk named Jacob de Zoet arrives at Dejima, a man-made island off Nagasaki that is occupied by the Dutch East Indies Company. Soon after arriving, Jacob finds himself immersed in a world of intrigue, corruption, power politics, ritual, religion, and forbidden love, elements that intertwine and intensify as Jacob's story and the story of Orito Abigawa, the Japanese midwife he falls in love with, develop. Before we sit down and have a conversation about this wondrous novel, we are very fortunate that David has offered to give us a reading from it. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, David Mitchell.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for sacrificing your beautiful evening to come and listen to me. And thank you for that those wonderful introductions as well. I recorded them, and when I'm having bad days, I'll just replay them on my iPod. And whenever I hear that Time magazine 100 most influential people thing referenced, I can still hear the laughter of scorn from both my mother and my wife. And my wife helpfully pointed out that I'm not even the most influential person in the house. There are 4 of us in sort of our immediate household, and we worked it out, and I had to admit she's right. I came in at number 5 after the washing machine. So it's really nice that Time magazine sort of gave me that accolade, but talk about a reality gap. Anyway, I'm going to do a brief reading from here. I think I'll just jump straight in and interrupt myself as and when. Picking slugs from the cabbages with a pair of chopsticks, Jacob notices a ladybird on his right hand. He makes a bridge for it with his left, which the insect obligingly crosses. Jacob repeats the exercise several times. The ladybird believes, he thinks, she is on a momentous journey, but she's going nowhere. He pictures an endless sequence of bridges between skin-covered islands over voids and wonders if an unseen force is playing the same trick on him. Until a woman's voice dispels his reverie. Mr. Dazuto? Jacob removes his bamboo hat and stands up, and Miss Iba Gower's face eclipses the sun. I beg pardon to disturb. Surprise, guilt, nervousness. Jacob feels many things. She notices the ladybird on his thumb. Tentor mushy. And in his eagerness to comprehend, he mishears, or bentor mushy. Or bentor mushy is luncheon box bug. She smiles. This, she indicates ladybird, is tentor mushy. Tentor mushy, he says, and she nods like a pleased teacher. Her deep blue summer kimono and white headscarf lend her a nun's air. They're not alone. The inevitable guard stands by the garden gate. Garden. They clash, don't they? Garden. Michael, we're going to have to organise a product recall here. By the garden door, it's going to have to be some things like that. Of course, lots you can get by reading, but only if you read that one aloud could you ever notice it. So I would have had to have read all 500 pages in my hut. God, no, too late now. Jacob tries to ignore him, the guard. It's ladybird in Dutch, gardener's friend. Anna would like you, he thinks, looking into her face. Anna would like you. Anna's his fiancée back at home in Zealand. She's of a higher social class, so the prospective father-in-law has said that he can only ask for a hand in marriage if he goes out east for 5 years to earn his fortune, thinking that's a nice way to get rid of the young guy. A gardener's friend, because ladybirds eat greenfly. Jacob raises his thumb to his lips and blows. The ladybird flies all of 3 feet to the scarecrow's face. She adjusts the scarecrow's hat as a wife might. How you call him? It's a scarecrow in Dutch, to scare crows away. But this one's name is Robespierre. Warehouse is warehouse oak. I love this about the Dutch. They named their warehouses the same way we name ships. And it sort of says something kind of quite interesting about the Dutch psyche, I think. Oh, a good thing about the Dutch psyche, of course. Monkey is William Pitt. Why Scarecrow is Robespierre? It's because his head falls off when the wind changes. It's a sort of a dark joke. Joke is secret language, she frowns, inside words. Jacob decides against referring to the fan until she does. It would appear at least that she is not offended or angered. The fan, this is just the 3rd encounter they've had. The first encounter, when they first met, he was working in a warehouse. She ran in after a monkey that had run away with a poor sailor's amputated limb. It's a long story, but it kind of makes sense at the time. It's really hard to get them to meet because Dejima is this sort of this place. It's a man-made island in Nagasaki Harbour where, as you heard in the introduction, the Dutch East Indies Company were allowed to sort of operate a trading post. Potentially a very rich place for a novel, I thought. But then once I started writing, I also realised it's an anti-plot device. The whole point was to prevent the unexpected. The Japanese sort of isolated it, the far western end of the country. It's a very small island. I say island, you might think of mountains and hills and trees. It was tiny, probably twice the size of this hall, 3 times, but very, very small, just one street, a few warehouses, that was it. And certainly during the trading season when it was busy, every 3rd or 4th person was a spy. So how can you get them to meet? If you want some kind of romantic interest, possibly budding, if not blossoming. So that was the amputated limb plot. That was sort of one answer. Anyway, big digression. She left a fan there. He took the fan away and couldn't get her face out of his head, so he disassembled the fan, he's something of an artist, and drew her face on it, and then reassembled it, and then managed to slip it to her on a later encounter, on encounter number 2. And he hasn't seen her since, so that's what he's talking about with the fan. If you're interested in the fan, then it appears later on in a book, drawn by actually my own mum, which is a bit Spinal Tap, isn't it, to get your mum to do the artwork. But it didn't... It was great, because it didn't cost me a bean. It's great. Mum, I've got a bit of a favour to ask. She used to be an artist in a former life. Anyway, that's the fan. So, may I help you, miss? Yes, Dr. Malinus asked, I come and ask you for laws and Mary? He asked, the better I know Marinus, thinks Jacob, the less I understand him. He asked, bid Domburger give you 6 sprogs of laws and Mary? Over here then, in the herb garden. He leads her down the path, unable to think of a single pleasantry that doesn't sound terminally inane. She asks, why Mr. Dazuto worked today as Dejima gardener? The truth is that he lost a gambling debt and he has to pay it back by working for the day in the garden. Because, the pastor's nephew lies through his teeth, I enjoy a garden's company. And as a boy, he leavens his lie with some truth, I worked in a relative's orchard. We cultivated the first plum trees ever to grow in our village. In village of Domburg, she says, in province of Zeeland. You are most kind to remember. Jacob breaks off a half-dozen young sprigs, and here you are. And for a priceless coin of time, their hands are linked by few inches of fragrant herb, witnessed by a dozen blood-orange sunflowers. I don't want a purchased courtesan, he thinks. I wish to earn you. Yes, he's got this fiancée back in Zealand, but it's 5 years away and a very far off, and men are men, and don't hold it too much against him. He's kind of basically a good guy. Thank you. She smells the herb. Rosemary has meaning. Jacob blesses his foul-breathed martinet of a Latin master back in Middleburg. Its Latin name is Rosmarinus, wherein ros is dew. Dew. Would you know the word dew? She frowns and shakes her head a little, and her parasol spins slowly. Dew is water found early in the morning before the sun burns it away. A midwife understands. Dew, we say asatsuyu. Jacob knows he shall never forget the word asatsuyu so long as he lives. Well then, Ros being dew and Marinus meaning ocean, Ros Marinus is dew of the ocean. And old people say that rosemary thrives, grows well, only when it can hear the ocean. The story pleases her. Is it true tale? It may be, let time stop, Jacob wishes. It may be prettier than it is true. So meaning of Marinus is sea? So Dr. Marinus is Dr. Ocean? You could say so, yes. Does your name, Iba Gawa, have a meaning? Iba is indigo. Her pride in her name is plain, and Gawa is river. So you are an indigo river. You sound like a poem. And you, Jacob tells himself, sound like a flirty lecture. Rosemary is also a woman's Christian name, I mean a given name. So my own given name is strange to sound casual. Jacob. She swivels her head to show puzzlement. What is Jacob? It's the name my parents gave me. Jacob. My full name is Jacob de Zoot. I must apologise to Randy. I chose a title for my book especially to confuse my introducers. And it's Zoot in Dutch, but you did a really good mid-Atlantic kind of version of it. She gives a cautious nod. Jacobu Dazuto. I wish, he thinks, spoken words could be captured and kept in a locket. My pronounce, Miss Ibergout asks, is not very good. No, you're perfect. You're perfect in every way. I mean, your pronounce is perfect. Crickets scritter and clerk in the garden's low walls of stones. I put occasionally these made onomatopoeic verbs in just to get my translators back. As, they sort of spend half a morning on the internet, scritter, I can't find it anywhere. And then they email me and I say, well, I made it up, sorry. It's just envy because they're so clever. They're usually novelists themselves, or they have brains the size of planets and speak many languages, and monoglot me is deeply envious. Miss Ibergawa, Jacob swallows, what is your given name? She makes him wait. My name from mother and father is Olito. The breeze twists a coil of her hair around its finger. She looks down. Doctor is waiting. Thank you for rosemary. Jacob says, you're most welcome, and doesn't dare say more. She takes 3 or 4 paces and turns back. I forget a thing. She reaches into her sleeve and produces a fruit, the size and hue of an orange, but smooth as hairless skin. From my garden. I bring many to Dr. Malinus, so he asked I take one to Mr. Dazuto. It is kaki. So in Japanese, persimmon is a kaki. Kaki. She rests it on the crook of the scarecrow's shoulder. Kaki. Robespierre, and I shall eat it later, thank you. Her wooden slippers crunch the friable earth as she walks along the path. Act, implores the ghost of future regret. I shan't give you another chance. Jacob hurries past the tomatoes and catches her up near the gate. Miss Ibergawa, I must ask you to forgive me. She has turned and has one hand on the gate. Why forgive? For what I now say. The marigolds are molten. You are beautiful. Her mouth opens and closes. She takes a step back into the wicket gate. It rattles. The guard swings it open. Oh, you damned fool, groans the demon of present regret. What have you done? Crumpling, burning and freezing, Jacob retreats, but the garden is quadrupled in length, and it may take a wandering Jew's eternity before he reaches the cucumbers, where he kneels behind a screen of dock leaves, where the snail on the pail flexes its stumpy horns, where ants take patches of rhubarb leaf along the shaft of the hoe, and he wishes the earth might spin backward to the moment when she appeared, asking for rosemary, and he would do it all again, and he would do it all differently. Stop there, thank you. Is this stage left?
Or the stage right.
Is this stage right? I've forgotten. Do you say stage left?
Are we okay sitting here? I was just told to sit in whatever chair he doesn't pick, so
and I'm on,
we're good.
And I'm on book tour mode, and I can't think or make any kind of decision on my own or remember which is left and right. So
you can call the washing machine.
The washing machine would know.
Pick seat. So, David, for the next little while, I'd like to ask you some questions about the Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. And I'd like to begin, I think, by asking you where the origins of this book came from. You said in one of your sides that picking a man-made island that was by design intended to barricade the people there away from the mainland was an anti-plot device.
Yes, it was.
Doesn't strike me as the most natural way to start writing a book, but maybe you could just tell us where you came up with the idea of this novel.
That's just because I only realised it was an anti-plot device about 18 months into writing the book after I'd spent the advance. In 1994, I was 24 and I went backpacking in the west of Japan. And as usual, I didn't have any money. I was in Nagasaki, and the Lonely Planet had said, if you don't have any money, then go to Chinatown. So I did, but I couldn't read the signs very well, so I got off at the wrong streetcar stop. Do you say streetcar here, or is it a tram?
Streetcar.
Is this true? Yeah, okay. I take nothing for granted here. Got off the wrong streetcar, and modern day Nagasaki, like many Japanese cities, probably they're sort of quite assaults on the eyeball, really. It's quite chaotic and jumbly, and overhead cables and advertisements. But there's a very graceful building I sort of spied from afar, and just beautiful and white, and obviously from a different historical period. And I went, and that's where I discovered, that's the moment I discovered Dejima. I wasn't a writer then, I just had aspirations, and I didn't get lunch that day. I got something more worthwhile than lunch. I got half a notebook full of notes about this place that I knew I'd want to write about one day. It took me some time. 4 books later, it was at the front of the queue, and so it was the place that made my little novelists on board Geiger counter go, you know, because you've got one too.
I don't know if it goes like that as quickly, but...
that's because I'm an older model. Yours goes,
I see. Mine is an iPhone app, actually.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You're gonna.
What's strange, and you're pointing out that this novel seems to, at least the idea of it, predates the other novels that you wrote, or that we've seen since. The big difference I found in reading this book was the third-person narration. Your earlier books feature a wild array of wonderful first-person narrators. Why did you choose to go with a third-person narrator this time?
Because I wrote it in the first person for the first 18 months, and it wasn't working. And when it's not working, you have to sit down and with a blank piece of paper and write to yourself why it isn't working. And you have to be very honest, and sometimes it can be quite painful because it might involve throwing away quite a lot of work. But on the other hand, you wouldn't have reached that point without the work, so maybe it's necessary. However, it wasn't working in the first person, and I sure as hell couldn't write a 500-page book in the second person. But it was scary because it was out of my comfort zone. Didn't know how to do it.
What did it give you that your first person, in terms of the opportunities as a writer, imagining this story, with a third person narrator? What could you do that you couldn't do with first person narration?
I should know. I should have a sharp answer, but it simply made it work. I spoke to A.S. Byatt, of all people, and said, the problem with the third person, it's not that I have a home phone number, it's just we were doing an event at one point, and the conversation came around at this very useful moment. The problem with the third person, well, with the first person, you know the person, you know what they do, what they think about this, and this, you know, how they speak, and pretty soon kind of the plot begins to coagulate. You know what they'll do because you know who they are. That's your plot. So you just start off with the person, and then sort of the plot sort of spreads out its tendrils. Third person, where do you start? Where do you stop? You've got infinity. How do you frame it? What do you leave in, and what do you leave out, and what do you put in? And Antonia Byatt, it gave me her special Paddington stare and said, you put in what you think the reader wants to hear. Okay. Maybe a creative writing course could have been a good idea. Yeah, okay. And then, of course, you've got kind of a spectrum of third-person narrative. You've got those sort of the 18th century ones in a way where the novel started, where you have omniscience and those sort of those mad sod novels from the 18th century, Fielding and Smollett. Smollett's great, really. Where he's, hello, welcome to my novel. He literally writes this at the beginning of Tom Jones, well, not quite literally, but almost. Step inside. We're going on a stagecoach journey together. I'm going to tell you about this chap called Tom Jones. And at this point, Tom was thinking. So this is omniscience. But then, I don't know. That's not done very often these days. And you kind of see why. Just wrote myself a few. You have to work out what to do with thought. Whose thoughts are you going to be able to hear? And so I just wrote myself a simple ground rule. There's per section of writing, there is only one head upon which the third person narratorial helmet, the 3NH for short, it's obtainable as an app, by the way, sits, and it's kind of got a spike that goes into the brain, and only that head can you hear the thoughts of. So that was my rule, and I stuck with it. And
you should definitely teach creative writing. I can imagine the students hearing that and thinking that makes total sense. I'll go out and do that with the spike on the head.
I can imagine the students hearing that and thinking, I want my money back. So, are you a first-person junkie, or are you a third-person?
I'm a third-person control freak myself.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I think we're all hoping that for your next book you write in the fourth person to see what you can come up with that way.
As a great James Wood quote, the house of literature has many windows, but only 2 or 3 doors. Isn't that smooth? Isn't that beautiful?
Very nice. I want to ask you a couple of questions about your main characters, about Jacob specifically. And one of the things that I found enjoyable and unexpected for a contemporary novel was that you took his religious faith very seriously, particularly in the early parts of the novel. You have this devout, dutiful clerk, and one of the loveliest evocations in the book is of Jacob with his contraband family psalter, taking it out of its hiding place in the wood boards, and then praying in a corner of his room that his family still be alive when he returns home. The homesick traveler, I think, is how you describe him. At that point, his not knowing yet how long he's going to be there. And as I said, it's very rare that we find thoughtful and moving representations of people who actually believe still in something higher in contemporary literature. What did writing about someone's faith like that allow you to do in terms of exploring this character's world?
It's not so much for what it would allow me to do as it needed to be there for the book to work. This is sort of the overriding question, and I guess you're the same. Looking at it backwards and deconstructing a done book, then you can sort of see the pieces. But before, when it's not yet a done book, when it's a not nearly yet done but the advance is spent book, at that stage, I keep talking about money, don't I? It's sort of worrying. The overriding question is, what can I do to make this damn thing work? And firstly, Dejima and the Dutch East Indies Company were nests of thieves, nests of vipers, all in it for themselves, and that was taken for granted. By making Jacob not a viper, I immediately make him different to more or less everyone else in the book. Secondly, we're in the past. It's a historical novel. It doesn't do to... it took me a long time to learn this when I was writing the book, hence 4 years. But historical fiction isn't just another genre with old-fashioned costumes and scratchy wigs. It's a much more serious project to take on. Hey, you've written something started in 1899. You know all this. What differentiates one time period from another? And I think the answer is, it is what is taken for granted. A big set, a big walloping group of things that are taken for granted in one period that are not taken for granted in 2010.
Right.
One big thing that was taken for granted in the past, it wasn't a universally devout period, of course, but Christianity was a much more formative, overriding, believed in, mind-forming phenomenon and set of beliefs than it is now. Therefore, in order to make the book work, in order for it to be a plausible, viable, airborne historical novel, it should be more widely taken for granted that Christianity is actually it. This is the answer. It's true. It's true. You die, you go to heaven, and you meet your loved ones. And if you want something, then you can pray to God, and He's an interventionist God, and pray hard enough, He will listen, etc., etc. Plus, it gives me a pretty good propulsion for my third chapter, if he's a believer, because he has to smuggle ashore. It's this very law-abiding, rule-obeying young man. But when he left Zealand, he was given a Psalter, a book of Psalms that's been in his family for 200 years. And when the Dutch ship arrived in Nagasaki harbour, all Christian artifacts the Japanese both despised and loathed and were afraid of Christianity, because of historical reasons it had sort of fomented the rebellion that precipitated the closure of the country. But arriving European ships were obliged to hand over Christian artifacts, crucifixes, books, etc., and they would be sealed in a barrel for the duration of the owner's stay, and then give them back afterwards. For Jacob, I can't do this. I just can't do it. It's like spitting on Jesus. I can't. It's like saying my faith isn't real. I can't. So he smuggles it ashore at great personal risk. But books where you don't notice the page numbers. You don't notice the page numbers because they have a means of propulsion, and that's the book. And also scenes and individual chapters also have a means of propulsion. And I couldn't resist it. I couldn't leave it out. So this sort of my desire to have this day when Jacob's smuggling ashore the book, and he doesn't this truly important book to him, and he doesn't know if he'll be getting away with it or not, and the reader doesn't know if he'll be getting away with it or not. It's actually sort of partly dictated who he is.
Well, and it also makes for one of the most exciting sequences in the early part of the novel, I'd say, when he actually gets it there.
I aim to please, Randy. Thank you. It's I wanted to make him uncool. It's sort of it's quite easy to write someone who's kind of basically Brad Pitt. It's a bit unfair to Brad Pitt because he's done some more interesting things recently. But cool is easy. Uncool, yet still identifiable with, and someone who's uncool who pretty soon wins you over to him or her, and you're rooting for him or her. That's a harder thing to do, and why write easy stuff?
Let me stay with the question of the novel's play with history, I guess you could say. You just explained there the kind of aesthetic reason for why it makes sense that Jacob would be a believer. But more broadly, this is a novel that's full of historical specificities. And I'm wondering if you could just say something about how you sort of dealt with the burden of history itself. This is not a documentary book by any means about 18th century Japanese life. So when you're working in such a specific place that has such a sophisticated, intricate structure of ritual and diplomacy and specific names for this, that, and the other, how does literary license figure in? How, in other words, do you manage that kind of back and forth between the cold expectations of history and then the liveliness of literary creation?
This is another occasion where that creative writing course might not have been a bad idea. It took me about 18 months to work out the answer to your question. But then once you get the answer, it's ludicrously simple, really. Big stuff you can't change. Don't change the dates of the Napoleonic War or the outcome. Otherwise, we would all be speaking French. But small stuff you must make up. Otherwise, you're writing history or biography. Medium-sized stuff, one example from the book being in 1808, the British sailed into Nagasaki Harbour a frigate called the HM frigate Phaeton. There's a good Wikipedia article if you're interested, and told the chief resident of Dejima, I'm sorry, your country no longer exists. It's been annexed by the French, which is true. We're the British. We are on opposing sides of the Napoleonic War. Bearing in mind that these people on Dejima probably hadn't heard of Napoleon at this point. Therefore, hand over the keys. This is now ours. And the chief resident actually, it was an ingenious man called Hendrik Doof, who has more than a little genetic code in Jacob de Zoet, refused and played a brilliant game of poker with no strong card other than Dutch guile. However, that's history. 1808. Book has to start in 1799. Last time the Dutch could get out there without sort of the Napoleonic Wars starting to interrupt the shipping. I can't have people hanging around for 8 years because otherwise it's a two-headed book, and I have to shift the date. So I brought it forward 8 years, and this is medium-sized stuff. You can tweak, but flag your tweaks. So instead of the HM frigate Phaeton, it's the HM frigate Phoebus. Phoebus being the father of Phaeton. And so that's it. don't change the big stuff, make up the small stuff, and tweak the medium stuff, but flag your tweaks. Flag your tweaks.
Flag your tweaks. You heard it here first, everyone. Flag your tweaks.
The man who flagged his tweaks.
I do have one question that plays to our local audience. How does a wraith-like Quebecois, who's one of the characters in your novel, show up in 18th century Japan?
Was he on the Phoebus? I forget, or was he on the Shenandoah, the first ship?
Your book.
Okay. It's my book, but I never read it. I read it and proofread it and proofread it and polish and polish and polish and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. But in the same way, sort of, you can't.
Well, I have to apologize. I said backstage I will ask you a series of historically specific questions about the tens of thousands of characters in your fiction. But I meant that as a joke, and then I lied.
Every ship, regardless of its nationality, was, as Melville notes very well in Moby Dick, a sort of floating UN. National affiliations very quickly meant very, very little on board a ship.
Castaways and renegades, Melville calls them.
Yeah. And there'd be cases in the early 19th century, clashes between the young, the young American Navy and the Royal Navy, where you have British men working on the American ships, Americans working on them. But strangely, your first loyalty is to your ship. And the crew came from all over the place. The Europeans on Dejima actually came from all over the place. The Dutch invented the multinational corporation, amongst other things, stock exchange, the boom and the bust, the futures fund. Ingenious people. Nature gave them nothing but a big plain of mud. So they had to devise new ways of making money. One of the ways was the Dutch East Indies Company. But to go out east was dangerous. You had a 4 in 10 approximately chance of dying of bad airs, malaria, which was not understood at all within a few weeks of setting foot on Java. If you had anything to lose, you wouldn't take that lottery, you wouldn't take that gamble. And there weren't enough Dutchmen with enough to lose to take it. So they would actually take people from any nation. Preferably not the Spanish, something repeated in the World Cup the other day, but the Dutch won when it mattered in 1588. And so this is why on Dejima you've got an Irishman, you've got someone from what was then the Austrian Netherlands, became Austrian Netherlands later, what is now Belgium anyway, and the same went for the ships, hence the wraith-like Quebecois.
I see, very good. One question about one of the settings on mainland, in Japan itself. I guess this is a question about where you place the temple on Mount Shiranui in terms of large, medium, and small history. This is a key setting in the second part of the novel, where the main female character is taken against her will, and it's a rather dark and strange place. Where did that come from?
My sick, fevered imagination. I made that up mostly. No, that's not fair to Shintoism. I made it up completely. However, that part of the world, sort of the southwest of Kyushu, historically was sort of a terra incognita. Incognito. You're an educated man.
Trams. Streetcar trams? Okay. No one? No?
Behave. So there's a convenient blank space on the map. It was unexplored until quite late in 19th century, really. Middle of the 19th century. and it's a sort of a, I can't answer your question too much without giving away any spoilers, really. Shall we move hastily on?
Sure,
To the next
we can skip,
yeah.
and they can encounter it and enjoy it for yourselves for sure. I guess I had one sort of final question, and it's that throughout your career you've been praised repeatedly for the dizzying structures and the intricacies of your novels. But in a recent interview with Wyatt Mason, New York Times Magazine, you spoke of your interest in human mud, which doesn't strike me as immediately intricate or particularly complex. So I was wondering if you could just tell us about your sense of human mud and how that concept figures into your writing about experience.
I don't know too much about your own personal life, but either a past or present partner. Think about your relationship with that person, and is it a straightforward, simple thing, or is it a more multifaceted and subtle and complex and shifting and evolving, many times more than any kind of simple novelistic structure you could ever compose? I would politely suggest the answer is probably that. Mm-hmm. It's much more one single relationship, sort of infinitely rich and puzzling and fascinating and wonderful when it works and miserable when it doesn't. At some point, probably in my early 30s, mid 30s, became a father. Have a relationship with my wife. We got the kids. We're kind of stuck with each other now, at least for a while. Need to work things through. You think about human mud becomes more interesting when you age, and it made me aware that there's probably a spectrum of writing which goes from muddy to hygienic. The hygienic end would have someone like Haruki Murakami, and when he's good, he's very, very good. And this isn't a better or worse thing. It's just his books happen to be generally devoid of messy, tangled relationships with your mum, and she didn't. And it sort of, whereas at the other end, we'd had say Marilyn Robinson. It's almost nothing but sort of the tectonic shifts, the slow evolutions, the sudden Joyce-like flashes. It's human mud. She does it brilliantly, and it's even in the books of home housekeeping. It's domesticity, but she sort of finds the infinity and the Emily Dickinson's a great example. Never left a room. It was nothing but washing up and washing clothes, and her life must have been, but she finds the universal in it. She's a bit of a digression. We got this spectrum when I was in my 20s or early 30s and thinking, structurally dazzling. I like the sound of that. I'd sort of go for that, but now I'm sort of moving along the spectrum towards the Marilyn Robinson end.
But it's wonderful mud you create on that end, let me say. The Wyatt Mason interview in the Times Magazine introduced me to a new critical term, which I didn't know, which was Mitchell geeks. Are you familiar with this term?
It sounds a bit arrogant, but if you read a feature on yourself, it's sort of like a diary gone haywire. When suddenly, oh my God, stop, pen. So I didn't actually read it. I'm really glad that the attention was there, but this is all new to me.
Well, the author of the piece makes note of the intensity of admiration that you can inspire in your readers, and he describes some of these people as being quote unquote Mitchell geeks, insofar as they are so intensely invested in your work that they've formed a tribe in and of themselves, which is my way of transitioning to reader questions.
Hey, he's smooth. Well, if you ever hit hard times with writing, Randy, which I'm sure you won't, then a career in broadcasting is waiting.
Thank you very much. I've got a lovely voice for television. We do have some time now for some questions from the audience. I have many more questions I could ask, but I thought it would be unfair for me to monopolize all of David's time. And so there is a mic right there. And if there are any Mitchell geeks or otherwise admirers of David Mitchell in the crowd that would like to ask a question, queue up and we'll go from there.
It would take a yard of guts to be the first person to walk over to the microphone. I think we should incentivize people.